Thank you, everybody, for having me. It's a particular pleasure to be here because of the work done here, but also because this was one where I was invited by a student, Alex Shaikov over there. And you don't get to say this often, but students keep you sharp. There's this wonderful line that Samuel Eliot Morison had in a nasty review about another historian, where he said, you get more backchat from freshmen than you do from milk cows, the historian in question having gone off to run a farm. And some of that backchat has provoked a lot of what you'll hear about today. So I'm very grateful to Alex, to Paige, to Raphael, and to the other students at Fletcher who've made a lot of what I do possible. And it's a real pleasure to see them working at this institution and really making a contribution to the way things go. So I'll tell you a bit about the book and how it came to be by way of setting it up. The book began in a moment of frustration and bad temper, which is normal for me, I guess. But this particular time, I was in Taiwan, in Taipei, trying to do research. And research was going badly for reasons we can talk about. But a brown smog had descended on Taipei, which is otherwise a lovely city. They said the smog came from Beijing. You can make of that what you will. Yes, you may.
This feedback is
off.
Not working.
Okay. Should I continue? Okay.
Now she knows which one to adjust. So.
Okay. Can everybody hear me back there too? Okay, great. So like I was saying, I was in Taipei, and this brown smog had descended on the city, which people were blaming on Beijing. I don't quite know if that was true or not, but that was the story. And little Kim had tested another nuclear device at this point. So I flipped on the TV, and of course the pundits were going on about how we're not going to get anywhere with North Korea until the Chinese get serious. What will it take for the Chinese to get serious about North Korea? We really have to get the Chinese to be serious about North Korea. And it was partly the smog, partly the research, partly just a general bad temper, but I kind of flung the remote at the TV and started cursing and said, you just don't get it. And as I said that in much more colorful language than I just used, I realized that what they just didn't get was something that was worth spelling out. Namely that North Korea was part of a larger set of issues for China. In other words, you weren't going to see movement on North Korea unless you saw movement on Taiwan, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, China's relationship with the United States, really China's place in the world. North Korea was just one part of a larger set of issues for them. And as I thought all this, I realized that it had been a similar case for Mao Zedong long ago, not identical, but similar. And at that point, the notion of a Chinese view of the world, a Chinese grand strategy, if you would, that had lasted from Mao through Deng Xiaoping, through Jiang Zemin, Jintao, and all the way to the present era, with variations, of course, was something that I thought would be worth exploring, partly because of the historical interest, but also because if we wanted to understand China today, I felt that some of this past history was worth getting into. So what do I mean by grand strategy? I define it in the book as marshaling different categories of power, so diplomatic, military, and economic, to achieve overarching national objectives. That overarching bit is key. So it's not the way we often talk about policy in the media, where it's the Russians did X in Syria, what do we do now? Or the Chinese have invested Y in Latin America, what do we do now? But really a more all-encompassing view of the world. What do we want in the world? How is what's happening in Korea or Taiwan or wherever capable of affecting our capacity to get what we want in the world? And then what do we do about it, if anything? Really a more overarching, all-encompassing objective. And that seemed to me to be something that the PRC had had. I'm not saying everything fit. These were people who were capable of inconsistency. But there was enough that fit that made it worth exploring a grand strategy, if you would. And the grand strategies that Chinese leaders pursued, as I saw it, had both consistency and differences. The consistency stemmed from two things. First of all, there was memory. And very specifically, the memory of being broken and being broken in specific ways. All the people we'll talk about today have this memory of China as something that was torn apart, whether in the warlord era, whether in the stories told about the Opium Wars, whether through self-inflicted destruction during the Cultural Revolution, whether through what was seen as almost collapse at Tiananmen Square. And those memories don't go away. The other thing that mattered was geography. All these people are dealing with a state that has long, vulnerable land frontiers and a very long, very porous coast from which invasion has come in the past. That sounds kind of basic, but it gives you a fundamentally different view of the world and your place in it than if you were in charge of a country that had 3 oceans, Canada and Mexico, for neighbors. You're just going to see the world differently, and thinking your way into that is important, I think. The differences in grand strategy stemmed from several factors. Personality and circumstance mattered here. Personality mattered actually much more in the case of Deng Xiaoping, I found out, than anybody. And circumstance matters because trying to keep China safe is different in 1949 than it would be in 1969, than it would be in 1989, and so forth, just because the world has changed around you. But through all these changes, all of China's paramount leaders see China as a brittle entity in a hostile world, and their job is to protect it. That's the overarching national objective I'll be talking about today. Basic security sounds kind of banal. Who doesn't want to be secure? There are some people who would say, there are grand strategies that are more ambitious. But it doesn't sound banal if you remember 2 things. First of all, think back to that bit I said about being broken, and being broken in specific ways. None of these people, right down to Xi Jinping, take the integrity of the Chinese state for granted. If you are running China, you wake up every morning and say, when is this thing going to fall apart? That could happen at any moment, which is a reality that in this country we don't grapple with, or haven't had to grapple with till fairly recently. The other thing that makes it less banal is if you think about the objectives often ascribed to China by people over here. China is out to overthrow the liberal world order, with very lackluster definitions of what said world order might be. China is out to overtake the United States as number 1. Those things might happen, but they would happen incidentally, I would argue. They would be subservient to that goal of basic security that I was just talking about. So how do you achieve that goal of basic security? You seek a balance of power in the Cold War and after. You have to modernize your military without disrupting your economy. And all the while, you have to keep the citizenry on your side, which is a little more problematic than it sounds. The exact mix of power and the way the goal of security is pursued shift from time to time. But these, I would argue, are variations on a common theme, not a departure from the theme itself. The best place to start in understanding this, I suspect, is going back to the story of how the state came into existence. How did China as we know it come about? And here I would like to start with a man who was still fairly young at the time, Mao Zedong, in 1920. And Mao says 4,000-year-old Great China, by which he means China with roughly the contours you and I know of it as having today. 4,000-year-old Great China is form, not reality. What we actually have in 1920, Mao argues, is a bunch of little Chinas. And the way to get Great China is to fortify those little Chinas and then cobble them together into something larger. In 1920, simply believing there could be a Great China is actually quite an ask. You're talking about a country that has at least 6 different governments, if you want to think of them as governments running their own show. You have foreigners with treaty ports having breached the coast. You basically have a lot of chaos. And to actually dream of a bigger country under all of it is quite an ask. But Mao believes in that vision. And over the course of the Chinese Civil War, World War II renewed, and then World War II and then the Civil War renewed, he'll set out to cobble together that Great China without any clear idea of where its boundaries are actually going to end, but he can see it somehow. One thing he does is he simply insists that the Jiangxi Soviet, this little patch of land he controls, is a state. It's just a patch of land, but Mao says, I can levy taxes here. I am not going to surrender control of my armed forces, and I can do diplomacy. It's a state that can go traveling. When it's lost to Mao's great rival, Chiang Kai-shek, head of the nationalists, Mao takes the state traveling, sets up in Yan'an, but it's still a state. Comparisons with de Gaulle's France might be worth making here. We're all familiar with Mao's ideas of warfare. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy retreats, we advance. We're swimming in the sea of the people. What's overlooked in Mao's case, however, during this time is that he's actually a very shrewd practitioner of the balance of power. He's capable of diplomacy with what would later be known as minority groups within China. So reaching out to Chinese Muslims, reaching out to Tibetans, reaching out to the warlords who work with Chiang Kai-shek. When World War II breaks out, he's capable of working with just about everybody. So there's diplomacy with the Soviets, there's diplomacy with the Americans. There is even as late as 1941, when the nationalists and communists had supposedly come together to fight the Japanese, the idea of working with the Japanese. Mao says, maybe we want to help pro-Japan forces, because the idea is the protection of China, but his China, not Chiang Kai-shek's. Now, the interesting question after World War II is, could Mao's China and Jiang's China have coexisted? And there does seem to be some evidence that you could have wound up with a situation a little like India and Pakistan, where you have two states that are kind of resigned to one another's existence, flare into warfare every now and then, but basically trundle along. But the civil war is renewed, and Mao prevails in it with a grand strategy similar to the one we saw evolving in the earlier era with war diplomacy. He's very good at peeling away Jiang's generals. Why don't you come over and work with us? It's easier than having to fight them, and paying shrewd attention to the political economy. He doesn't have to be an economic genius, and he's not. He just has to manage the economy on his side a little better than Chiang Kai-shek does on his, which he does quite successfully. One thing that I want to emphasize while talking about the Civil War, because it almost always gets overlooked, is that some of the most serious, most formative military engagements come after 1949, when the PRC is declared. Down south against Bai Chengshi, the remainder of Jiang's armies, to the west in Xinjiang and Tibet, where air power suddenly becomes important to them, and they realize they're going to have to use air power. Along the coast, where they suffered their first loss to the nationalists in a long time in the Battle of Guningtou and Jinmen Island, they take the lessons from that battle, which basically come down to naval warfare is different. You have to know about currents and how to land, and apply it to Hainan Island, which they take successfully, thereby giving themselves a perch in the South China Sea. What you're beginning to see is a ragtag bunch of guerrillas, basically, transform into something like a modern army, or having the idea that to be a modern fighting force, you need something different. The other thing that happens at this point, of course, is diplomacy, and here the emphasis tends to be on Mao's talks with Joseph Stalin. We don't tend to think of either Mao or Stalin as peace-loving people, but at this time they're talking about 10, 15, Stalin even gets ambitious and says 20 years of peace in which to do marvelous things. They're tired. They want to have some room to breathe. The other interesting point is that even while he's in Moscow, talking to Stalin, Mao is cabling to his subordinates in Beijing saying, I want you to reach out to the Americans, reach out to the Japanese, reach out to the British, reach out to the Germans. They might be capitalists, they might be imperialists, but we have to work with them in order to survive. Leaning to one side, as the Entente with Moscow is often characterized, doesn't mean falling over on that side. There's room to work with everybody. Now, it's interesting to speculate on what would have happened if Mao had had those 10, 15, 20 years to breathe, but that room is eliminated by events in Korea. There's two things to emphasize about the Korean War. The first is that the decision-making on Korea is not a given, either on the American side or the Chinese side. Mao is still only first among equals in the Politburo, and there's quite a bit of debate about whether or not the Chinese want to intervene in North Korea. Mao's case for it is a romantic one. It goes hard on the heart to watch our revolutionary brothers suffer. How can we do this? And he's got people in the Politburo saying, look, it's crazy to go in there. We've been fighting nonstop. We're tired. We're still dealing with other problems. Why do you want to go pick a fight with the Americans in Korea? And he has to summon Peng Dehuai, his marshal out in the West, to come back and make the geostrategic case for it, which comes down to you cannot have a hostile power perched on your northeastern frontier and along your coast. Remember, Truman's neutralized the Taiwan Strait. Peng says you can't have a hostile power in both those places and expect to hold on to the state that you have worked so hard to bring about. It's not doable. And that is the argument that carries the day and gets the Chinese into Korea. The other thing that's worth noting about Korea is that it's not a war occurring in isolation. You still have hostile forces ravaging the coast. You still have Kuomintang forces down south. You still have Tibet to deal with. And you have Americans parachuting in all along those vast borders that I mentioned. And even with the armistice in Korea, those problems aren't going to go away. You are still engaged in a war and the possibility of war along all fronts. So how do you deal with it? First of all, you're going to seek a balance of power. So we're going to lean to one side with the Soviet Union. This is convenient. It's ideologically nice. The Soviets give us money and weapons, which is great. But that doesn't mean we're not going to reach out to other people, too. One way in which the Chinese conception of great power politics seems to differ from the way we think about great power politics in college courses, at least, is they have an appreciation of the role of smaller powers. Moscow and Washington aren't the only game in town. Talking to the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Thais of the world matters too. Talking to Poland and India matters as well. The Americans have alliances directed against us? Great. We can reason with those allies, albeit firmly, and ask them to help us. Pakistan, Thailand, even Britain and Japan, we can talk to. And maybe, just maybe, they can reach out to the Americans on our behalf. It's astonishing how much effort goes into trying to persuade Pakistan and Britain to reason with the Americans. We can even, Mao's diplomats seem to think, reach out to the Americans. That's going to founder over eventual disagreements on Taiwan, where Jiang's forces have taken refuge. But if you look at what they're doing throughout this time, the attempt in China's part seems to have been to remain closer to all the other players in the game than they are to one another. Not saying it's a successful attempt, but that's the goal nonetheless. It's also an attempt marked by a willingness to keep talking no matter what. So the goal of negotiations is to achieve a desirable outcome. If you don't achieve a desirable outcome, it is also desirable to just keep talking. Because if you keep talking, you might find a way of living to tomorrow. And then, who knows, you might find an achievable outcome then. Not that they won't use force. They do in the Taiwan Straits. And there's this very dangerous idea that force can be dialed up and down to signal intentions. There's the decision to build a bomb in 1955, which is going to take fruition eventually. But force is a backup to diplomacy. It doesn't mean you don't do diplomacy. Okay. In the late 50s and early 60s, you begin to see a shift in the strategic environment in which the PRC is operating, an attempt to find a new balance of power with that. There's a shift in the relations with the Soviets. There's a ridiculous spat over joint radar and nuclear submarines. They're appalled by the Soviet refusal to stand up for them over Taiwan and Tibet. The crossing of nomads along the Xinjiang frontier gives them grief. There is the perception in all this that Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, is on the imperialist fence, not helped by the fact that Khrushchev has quite a good time when he visits the United States. But the idea in China is that you can win him back. If you talk to him nicely and then threaten him and then bully him and then coax him, you can talk him down from the imperialist fence and bring him back to you. The key point in all this from a Chinese perspective is that they leave room open for a return to agreement with the Soviets down the line. The cooling of relations between China and the Soviet Union, and this has resonance to this day, has an impact on their client states, North Korea and North Vietnam, which find it very easy to play the two off against one another, and the North Koreans especially do this very effectively. You see a similar dynamic in South Asia, where relations with India, which was once upon a time supposed to be China's great partner in post-imperial unity, go flat over a ruckus in Tibet. But the damage to the Sino-Indian relationship doesn't mean abandoning South Asia altogether. You reach out to new partners there. You've lost India, great. You can talk to Pakistan, Burma, Nepal. These countries matter too. And it doesn't, of course, mean giving up on reasoning with the Indians altogether. Instinctively, they get the importance of dealing with smaller countries, though how that translates into on-the-ground engagement is a different matter. There's one other realm about grand strategy that's worth talking about here, and that's political economy. And here, of course, the discussion tends to focus on Mao's great leap forward, that insane plan to overtake Britain and the United States, with massive communes, massive dams, and the eventual cost of tens of millions dead. The important point I want to make that gets overlooked very often is that this is a national security plan. Mao doesn't want to overtake the Brits and the Americans for the heck of it. His argument is that the reason we were conquered in the past is that we lacked a modern military and modern defense. To have a modern military and modern defense, Mao argues, you have to have modern industry and modern agriculture. In short, you have to have a modern economy. That's the fount of power. It's a very reasonable point, and it's the same point Deng Xiaoping's later going to make. It's just that Mao, having grasped the importance of the economy, has no clue of what to do about it. Proof positive that you can have a grand strategy, and it can still be a very bad one. He's allowed, incidentally, to persist in it, not because of just his own vision, which is up and down, but also because he has a ton of people in his system, including Zhao Ziyang, who's later going to be feted as Deng's great economic reform architect, telling him, no, Chairman Mao, it's not the policy that's at fault, it's the way it's being implemented. The problem here isn't your vision of the Great Leap Forward, it's that you have cadres stealing grain from people. If you actually implemented it right, we could solve all our problems within 2 weeks to a month. And that's a very dangerous idea, and you can see here the idea of something like the Cultural Revolution taking shape. If only you fixed the people, if only you rewired their minds, then everything would be okay. And that is one of the things that leads you to the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution is a tricky phrase because it obscures how many things are actually happening in China between 1966 and 76, and I kind of want to break those down over here. The first phase is the attack on embassies, the craziness abroad, and the turning in on Chinese authorities. It's a dramatic departure from just about everything we've talked about thus far, a departure from strategic prudence, a departure from common sense. The second phase is marked by a return to grand strategic thinking, and this seems to have been triggered by the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Mao begins thinking in terms of balance of power of politics again because he's suddenly worried about the possibility of the Brezhnev doctrine being applied to him. Remarkably, despite all his attempts to dismantle it, he still has a military that can function. It does quite well in terms of just maintaining the status quo on the Sino-Soviet border where war breaks out in 1968 to 69. And in thinking about these balance of power of politics and in having the luck to have the Nixon-Kissinger team in DC at the time, he achieves the Sino-American rapprochement. There's one thing that's worth saying about the rapprochement because this gets misunderstood so often over here. The way we tell the story is the Chinese and the Soviets fell out. Henry Kissinger grandly swooped in, got the Chinese on our side, all problems solved. This was genius on our part. That's not quite how it works. There's a dramatic gap between 1969, when the Chinese and the Soviets are at war, and 71, when Kissinger actually gets to China. And during that time, because the Chinese aren't stupid, and are not counting on the Americans to do exactly what they would like the Americans to do, they work very hard to contain the damage to their relationship with the Soviet Union. Even when they have achieved the rapprochement with the Americans, they do not abandon the idea of getting back on cordial terms with the Soviets. Just because you're going to lean towards the American side doesn't mean you're going to abandon the Soviets altogether. And Mao is actually irate when Kissinger talks about trying to help him out in a war against the Soviets because he thinks the Americans are trying to push him into a war with the Soviets, which is something he doesn't want. It's not just Henry Kissinger who thinks it's a good idea to be closer to the other two sides in a triangle than they are to one another. He's got the luxury of geography and is able to achieve it better than Mao could, but the Chinese know what they're doing. The other thing that's worth noting about the rapprochement is that with it come the beginning of what we know of as opening and reform, typically ascribed to the Deng era if you're very current with the scholarship. Some people will argue for Hua Guofeng. But it happens in the late years of the Mao era, and one indicator is that Deng, who was rusticated during the Cultural Revolution, is rehabilitated. And he comes to Mao and he says, you've got to put this country to work. There is enormous entrepreneurial energy at its edges, and it's languishing in pain because of what you're doing at the center. No country in the world, Deng argues, can go it alone. You have to become part of the globalized world economy. And Mao says, great, hop to it. One indicator of hopping to it, trade with America burgeons. Exports to the United States go from none to about $156 million worth between 1971 and 76. Imports go from nothing to over $160 million worth in the same time. China's open for business, and this is happening during the Mao era. But the dark forces that Mao had unleashed during the Cultural Revolution never quite went away, and this is where the third phase comes in. You can start a Cultural Revolution, but stopping it is another thing. There are people who actually believe this gospel of revolution, not production, that the die-hard Cultural Revolutionaries had. And the Gang of Four, Jiang Qing, Wang Hongwan, Zhang Chunqiao, and Yao Wenyuan, go after what they see as the technocrats in Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. What you get, in effect, is this idea of revolution, Cultural Revolution, versus opening and reform, playing out in the politics of Zhongnanhai. And Mao sort of fluxes in the middle, trying to maintain his own power position, till Deng Xiaoping gets too big for his britches in Mao's book. And in July 4th, 1976, Deng is stripped of his posts and sent away to a quote-unquote safe place. Hua Guofeng, whose main achievement is to look a lot like Mao, is named the chairman's successor. Mao himself dies September 9th, 1976. He has unified the country, which was a huge ask. He has stood down superpowers, and he has killed millions of his own people and opened up forces that could jeopardize just about everything he has achieved. Make of him as a grand strategist what you will. Okay. We tend to take the China we see today for granted. This was bound to happen because these were the forces of history. It didn't have to unfold that way. China gets lucky during this time. And one way it gets lucky is that Deng Xiaoping returns to power. The most interesting thing about Deng Xiaoping, to my mind, is that Deng travels by boat. There is nothing, as Water Rat says to Mole in The Wind and the Willows, absolutely nothing half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. If you simply mess about in boats the way Deng has, you're going to have a very different view of the world than someone who's traveled only by land. You will have taken a voyage and stopped off at ports like Singapore and Hong Kong, and you will have seen the riches that the sea holds, ships bringing in goods from distant harbors, people haggling in several different languages in the docks and making money of it. When you get to France, you'll take safe harbor with overseas Chinese, the Huaqiao, and you will say to yourself, why are they getting rich when Chinese in China aren't? All these things you can talk to Mao about, but Mao's only traveled by land. He's not going to feel them with the force that only experience can generate. And that is Deng's key insight. He's a spy. He's run missions behind enemy lines during the Civil War, so he knows how to keep quiet. He's good at suffering fools, though he doesn't suffer them gladly. He's a believer in the party. He talks very early on about quashing warlordism and liberalism, as he calls them, because he's seen what they can do. Certain practical bent, the agreement negotiated with Tibet that allows some measure of stability there back in the 1950s, is a harbinger of what you'll see in Hong Kong with one country, two systems. And Deng's fingerprints are all over both. He's an impatient, caustic character, but that wit isn't given as free rein as often as one might think. Anyway, he comes back when Hua Guofeng has taken on and successfully defeated the Gang of Four, and it's here that his political savviness is very much on display. He's intent on saying, I'm not going to take credit for this. You, Chairman Hua, have won a great victory, not just for yourself, but for the party and for China and for the Chinese people. He is really good at flattery. He could do this all day. He'd lived the Mao years. And he is hell-bent on refusing the top job. Alone, if all the people will talk, Deng is not going to be chairman of anything. Because, why take the formal post of chairman of the party or chairman of the country when it's so much easier to get what you want done by just having acolytes in those positions and pulling the levers of power like a puppet master? Formal leadership trappings are for other people. Deng's just interested in getting things done. And what he's interested in getting done mostly is opening and reform. And like I said, we take those for granted, but there is a dazzling act of intellectual warfare that he has to launch to make them happen. There are people who actually believe that getting rich is bad. And Deng says, no, that's all wrong. The problem with you people is you take Mao Zedong thought literally. You can't interpret Mao Zedong thought literally, Deng argues, without doing damage to it. To truly get Mao Zedong thought, to get its essence, you have to grasp that its central precept is to seek truth from facts. Seek truth from facts, Chairman Mao said. And seeking truth from facts, you find that Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, these places are bounding way ahead of us economically, and we're nowhere. We're still arguing about whether raising 3 ducks is socialism, but when you get to 5, it's capitalism, or whether letting wages rise to 50 yuan or 100 yuan constitutes capitalism. That's ridiculous. Getting rich is not anti-Mao. Indeed, it is anti-Mao to not be productive. And the people who don't want you to be productive, the people who don't want you to get rich, that's the Gang of Four. Those evil cultural revolutionaries who visited so much misery on you and your families, they don't want you to get rich. It's nice to associate a program you don't want with people you don't like. It's a great way of doing business. There's no sincerity here. He'll tell George Bush Sr. at one point that the only reason he's not criticizing Mao is that to criticize Chairman Mao too sharply would be to deny a crucial part of the country's history. You do that, there's chaos, and chaos is the one thing Deng is bent on avoiding at all costs. Avoid chaos and focus on getting rich. That's the Deng motto, and it works. So agrarian reform is encouraged. If it works, let it work. He wants modernization of industry. That means reaching out to foreigners for help, notably the Japanese, for investment, trade deals, and advice. Technology transfer is sought from the West. When the Americans come in talking about textiles, it's like, don't focus just on textiles. There's a lot more going on here. And it's not just the great powerhouses that are courted. Brazil, France, these places matter too. Most notably, you see an attempt to reach out to the Huaqiao, the overseas Chinese, especially with Taiwan. There had long been this healthy smuggling relationship across the Taiwan Straits. And Deng says, this is great. You're all getting rich. Just bring it out into the open. Let us all participate. And that is how the economy works. The other side to getting your house in order economically is cuts. So aid to third world countries is no longer going to be at the scale it was in the Mao years. You'll tell third world countries, we stand by you, we sympathize with you, but we've suffered too, and there have to be some painful cuts. China first is the motto of the era. The one-child policy, which is an absolutely disastrous idea, is meant to impose some fiscal discipline on the country. And finally, there are cuts to the military. Part of this is simply forcing aged heroes to retire. The youngest of them, as Deng scoffs at one point, are 64 or 5. 5 years, they'll be 70, and they have salaries and perks. This is no way to run a country. So we're going to have a retirement system for you guys. It's not that he's a pacifist. It's not that he doesn't like the idea of having a healthy military around. It's just that he thinks that your military is meant to serve a purpose. It's meant to keep you secure. And if it gets too heavy, top-heavy for your economy, it's not going to do that. So we need a navy, not a blue water one, but one that can protect our shores. We need an air force, and this is where the bulk of our investment is going to go. That is how things are going to work. Diplomatically, like Mao, he believes in staying closer to other powers than they are to one another. Closer to home, this notion of one country, two systems, and joint development, which he reaches out to the Philippines, are his big innovations. He's ridiculously pleased with them. And it actually goes a certain distance, one country, two systems, and starting a debate in Taiwan about whether or not this is the path to the future. And we can talk about that during Q&A if you want. With Japan, yes, the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands and the textbooks are a problem, but Japan's one of the main engines for China's economic miracle. Why squabble over it? Even with the Soviets, there are very patient negotiations that come to a brief halt when the Soviets invade Afghanistan, but these are resumed. And as he points out to anybody who'll listen, he doesn't halt trade with the Soviets at any point. So keep on talking even when you disagree. So one great exception to this, and that's the Chinese invasion of Vietnam. There's many different explanations for why that happened. The most convincing one to my mind is that even Deng Xiaoping could make a mistake, do something stupid, and then not admit it. Notably, to my mind, he doesn't talk to the Vietnamese afterwards, which suggests some resentment and pique. Tiananmen Square is very much part and parcel of this grand strategy. One of the questions in the West that comes up very often is how could a man who was so liberal economically, who seemed so bent on modernizing China, do something like Tiananmen politically? And Deng's answer would have been, you've got the framework all wrong. The reason I have been able to liberalize economically is that I had a firm political hand at the center, that I cracked down on these ridiculous notions that people had. When protests break out in 1986, they have to be stopped, he points out. The problem is that the party is not asserting its authority. And remember that Deng is a victim of the Cultural Revolution. His son was turned into a paraplegic by a gang of rampaging students. So where some people look out and see student protesters, Deng sees forces that have hurt him personally and that could undo just about everything he has worked for. Young people, he argues, he doesn't like young people. They just don't get it. They don't understand that you need a strong central party to keep China going. So when 1989 happens, the biggest unanswerable question to my mind is not why did he pull out the tanks, but what on earth did he take so long over? And that's a question worth pondering. The other thing that's worth noting about Tiananmen Square is that it's for a reason, and he stands by that reason. It is for the continued good of the country, which means continued opening economic reform, continued reform and opening. And there's two ways of seeing that. One is that he stands down foreign criticism, but the other is that when there are people within the party who say Tiananmen proves you were wrong, and we have to turn we have to turn back on reform and opening. Deng says that's nonsense. We did this for a reason. And when people don't listen to him, he goes marching down south telling people, didn't you get rich on reform and opening? It's a populist movement that forces those bickering politicians in Zhongnanhai to get with Deng's program. Bear in mind that Deng is doing this when he is supposedly in retirement. Xi Jinping was recently criticized for scrapping the retirement system that Deng set in place. Deng's retirement system is for other people. He's fine with conducting a populist movement for the greater good, if you will. Other people can retire. Deng Xiaoping will march merrily on and drag China into the modern age. But even Deng had to die someday. We all do. And this is where Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao come in. The rap against Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao used to be that they were dull. These aren't the men Mao was. These aren't even the men Deng Xiaoping was. They don't do anything. They just stand there and make wooden speeches. It might be that I'm getting older. It might be the times we're living through, but I've begun to think that dull leadership at certain times is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Make America dull again is probably a slogan that people would do well to adopt. It's surprising dullness specified how much actually happens during the Jiang and Hu years and how successful they were in weathering it. If you think of the crisis in the Taiwan Straits, if you think of the Hainan spy plane incident, if you think of the accidental on purpose, depending on who you talk to, American bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, if you think about the financial crises of 1997 and then 2007 to 8, there's a lot going on that they have to weather, and they do it quite well. One thing they do quite well to start with is to just decide on the fundamental course China is going to take. Do you stick with reform and opening? Do you democratize, which quite a few people are talking about in the wake of 1989? Or do you go back to the good old, bad old Mao years? And Jiang very interestingly says, we're going to stick with the current course and not change too much, but we're going to bring ideology back. Not ideology as something we believe in and sets us off on crazy projects, but as a shibboleth, if you will, as a shared code that binds us all together. So we're going to continue with Deng Xiaoping's version of ideology, which involves all of us getting rich. But it's just something that young people and party members can latch onto so that they don't get this ridiculous idea about democracy being good for them and Western ways being good for them. Very interesting on religion, too, Jiang Zemin. He's got this incredibly moving set of musings on Xinjiang, where he says, religion's not going to go anywhere. It's been there before the party. The idea is to make religion compatible with the party, and that means, we'll just have to monitor it and make sure there's room for both to be both. The advantage of invoking Deng's version of ideology is that you can stick with getting rich. There's the same trade-off with ethnic minorities out west, economic gain for political independence, and there are links between the East Coast and the West. You open up new markets on Western frontiers. Violence in Xinjiang, for example, will cause Hu Jintao to focus on economics. It's not just about knocking heads together and rounding people up, but bringing GDP per capita in that region up to the level of the rest of the country. Same deal with Tibet. Now, there's challenges to getting rich. One of them is corruption, and if you are cop, judge, and enforcer all at the same time, dealing with corruption can be difficult. The other thing, of course, is when you're part of the globalized economy, you're vulnerable to global shocks, and the Southeast Asian financial crisis brings them home to them. You have to make sure money is available to finance in investment banks, keep the RMB stable, boost internal demand. When the 2007 to 8 financial crisis hits, the Chinese are actually very swift to step in. And Hu Jintao is going to come to Washington and insist, you have to stick with the system. You have to stick with free trade. You have to stick with financial liberalization. You have to stick with aid to the rest of the world because we all have a stake in this. He's going to turn to BRICS, to emerging markets. You see again that notion of players other than the biggest kids on the block mattering. Small friends matter. The other thing that's worth noting about these years is the lessons of 1989. So the interpretation in this country, for example, that was current during the 90s was the end of history. We won the Cold War because democracy and free market capitalism work, and this is the way the world is going to go, and we have a unipolar moment. The Chinese don't see it that way. They see a more multipolar world. They do see challenges in dealing with the Americans because much of the world has bought into those notions of democratization. The G7 is talking about democratizing the erstwhile socialist world. And the basic grand strategy remains the same, a quest for a balance of power, being closer to everyone than they are to one another, and judging relationships with other countries as a whole rather than issue by issue. And this is what marks dealings with the Americans. The problem with the Americans, of course, is that you don't know what they'll do next. One day they talk about human rights. The next day they talk about trade deals. One day they say they're not going to do anything about Taiwan. The next they are sending aircraft carriers towards the island. So several crises mark the Sino-American relationship at this time, and we can talk about them more, but think about the 95 to 6 Taiwan Straits crisis. Think about the bombing of the embassy in Yugoslavia, and think about the Hainan spy plane incident. I'll say 2 things about them over here very quickly. One is that they should never have happened. It took enormous amounts of irresponsibility on each side to get things to the point where they did. The other thing that's worth noting is that the Chinese are very quick to try to dial things down, as are the Americans for that matter. But there's a sense that the Sino-American relationship is larger than Taiwan. It's larger than our anger over a dead Chinese pilot in the Hainan spy plane incident. This is a relationship that's about trade. It's about China's accession to the WTO. It is about investment deals. We have a lot to work for together, and sacrificing that larger picture to an issue that is temporary and in the here and now is not something that Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao later would be willing to do. America is just one piece on the board. Stronger relations with Russia and Central Asia are sought. Post 9/11, this is going to seem rather far-sighted because you can't leave the Americans unchecked in China's western frontier. But this is when you see trade and exchange with Moscow really taking off, proclamations of friendship, and of course the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was a multilateral organization formed to deal with terrorism, splitism, and extremism, and to, forgive the jargon, this is just the official line, promote multipolarization, which means getting the Americans out of the region. Who calls these countries the old Silk Road? Anything Hu could do, Xi could do grander. So old Silk Road becomes new Silk Road, becomes Belt and Road, becomes one belt, one road, till you don't know what's going on. But that is what they are starting off. They seek better relations elsewhere too. Jiang restores diplomatic ties with Indonesia, normalizes relations with Vietnam. Farther friends are sought in Latin America and Africa too. Even on Taiwan, which incidentally is the one big blind spot in Chinese grand strategy. I'm happy to talk more about that. You could try. Lian Jian, the Kuomintang chairman, visits China during this time for the first talks between the heads of the Kuomintang and the CCP for years, because you can rule through local chieftains, right? If this person is on your side and is then in charge in Taiwan down the line, this might be a good investment. And that idea seems to have been there. That's the diplomatic and economic aspect of it. They are not neglecting the use of force. The world is not peaceful. The Gulf War, Jiang argues, has shown us the role of electronics and the role of technology. So active defense is going to remain the precept of the day. We're not invading any country, but a PLA without modern technology, Jiang argues, would be powerless to prevent, an independent Taiwan. So you have to modernize. That means cuts in manpower and a focus on technology. There's one other aspect to this, which is that the troops have to be taught that they are subordinate to the party's leadership, which sounds kind of fundamental, but the amount the Chinese insist on it, you begin to realize that in a country where the lines between the civilian and military spheres haven't been as clearly demarcated as they are over here, for example, the fears of a military coup never quite go away. One of the things that happened post-1996 was that Joseph Prieur, who was head of PACOM at the time, was worried that he didn't know what his opposite counterpart in the PLA Navy was doing. So he reaches out to the PLA Navy and they start talking to one another, which is what you would want them to do. And Jiang comes to Hawaii, and as Prieur tells the story, poked me in the chest, but in a nice way. He said he'd been poked in the chest in not nice ways, but this was a nice way. And he asks, "What are you doing with my soldiers?" And Prieur says, "Well, I'm trying to communicate and build trust." And Jiang says, "Well, Admiral, for there to be trust, there must first be understanding. And for there to be understanding, there must first be communication." Which is Jiang's way of saying, I'm a little uncomfortable with your talking to my troops without my being involved. Is this going to be something that becomes an American-sponsored military coup against China? Is the fear at the back of one's mind. It's a very different way of doing civil-military relations from the one we do, but it's one worth bearing in mind. The other question this leaves us with is, where is the line between active defense and hostility? China's taking all these measures to defend itself, the militarization of space, the investment in modern weaponry. But how does defending yourself translate to smaller countries around your neighborhood? Does it appear offensive to them? Where is that line? And this is what gets us into Xi Jinping's story. I'll talk about Xi Jinping very quickly. The key thing to understand about him, to my mind, is insecurity. And it's insecurity born of the Cultural Revolution. Famously, he was taken away when he had expected as good a future as you could possibly expect in Mao's China. His father called, an enemy of the revolution. Xi himself rusticated and sent to hard labor. And that notion of everything being taken away and things falling apart suddenly sits with him for a very long time. If you're Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and you look at what China has been through, you say, well, this country has problems, but given where it's wound up, not bad. If you're Xi Jinping, you look at China and say, this country has problems, and those problems could fester and kill us tomorrow, so we have to act on them much more immediately. If you're Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, you say, Cultural Revolution, terrible thing, can't be allowed to happen again, so we'll allow a little bit of consensus to forge. If you're Xi Jinping, however, you look at it and say, Cultural Revolution, a terrible thing, can't ever be allowed to happen again, and the only way to make sure it never happens again is that I personally am in charge, so that I can make sure it never happens to me again. It's a different personality dealing with a similar problem. Security to Xi Jinping becomes about both internal and external matters, and that's why the new National Security Council is formed. It's a way of centralizing decision-making on this. Diplomatically, you say China seeks peaceful development, but won't brook interference with its core interests. A lot of ink was spilled trying to explain this new model of great power relations. Basically, if you read what Xi Jinping is saying, it comes down to treat us like equals. Which is not a very revolutionary statement, but there it is. There is, again, that notion of a balance of power, trying to stay closer to other parties than they are to one another, working with people where it suits them. This is why the climate agreement with the United States was such a big deal. Also, incidentally, why it was such a big deal when the United States backed out. This was an existential problem Xi had begun to recognize, and not doing something about it was not okay. But even as relations with America go topsy-turvy, reaching out to Europe, reaching out to Japan. With Japan, incidentally, you see the virtues of talking despite things going wrong. So you go from almost crisis in the East China Sea to the frostiest handshake in history between Xi Jinping and Abe, to Japan and South Korea and China standing together at the WTO and saying, you know, whatever the Americans say, we all have an interest in this working out. All the way down to Abe saying, my pal Xi and I are going to figure out what's happening in Asia. Ties with Russia continue to strengthen. And the one problem in all this remains Taiwan, which, as I said, is a blind spot. Anybody could have told Xi Jinping that a Chinese leader appearing with a Taiwanese candidate for election would kiss that candidate's chances of getting elected goodbye. Nobody did. Result, you have Tsai Ing-wen in office. One Belt, One Road, to my mind at least, is the natural consequence of a country that has grown to the economic heft and size of China, taking a natural economic interest in the world, but we can talk more about that during Q&A. So if you look at where China was in 1920 and where it's wound up today, and you say basic security, you'd have to grant that these people were fairly successful. It seems to be that the grand strategies worked. What this does not get us into, however, is the perils of success. What if in becoming secure, you became so big, so powerful, that you terrified your neighbors into upping defense spending, as is happening in Japan and Vietnam? What if your particular model of getting rich and safe, which is a model, in fairness, that many of the rest of us have pursued, involved economic growth, but economic growth devoid of attention to environmental sustainability? Chinese civilization, remember, sprung up around rivers. How much good is an aircraft carrier or a state-owned enterprise or even getting debt under order or One Belt, One Road going to do you if those rivers run dry? Those are questions for which the grand strategy we've talked about does not have answers. So perhaps the real moral of the story is, yes, they were successful, but those whom the gods wish to punish, they give what they wish for.